Well, Alistair, thank you very much for coming on the Privileged Man podcast. Absolute joy and a pleasure to have you. If you could you enlighten our listeners and just give us a bit of a back story on where you came from, right from the beginning to today?
First of all, Pete, great to be here. I came from a caring family, grew up in a farming community in Wiltshire where my father was a farm manager, so no farm for me to take over. I was educated locally, Wootton Bassett Comprehensive School, which actually worked for me. I can't say I excelled academically, but it worked for me. I loved home life, wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Probably a policeman, wasn't brave enough, possibly a doctor, wasn't intelligent enough. And my father discouraged me from following in his footsteps as a farm manager because it was possibly a good way of life, but equally in his mind under-rewarding in certain ways. So I was encouraged to look further afield and ended up doing an estate management course, urban estate management course, effectively in Birmingham Polytechnic, as it was then, which I scraped into because my A-levels were far from exceptional, and enjoyed that. Didn't really know what was ahead, but managed to get some work experience at Knight Frank and Rutley, as it was then, back in the very early 80s. And although, as I've said to other people in the past, bizarrely, I can't remember why I did, being a relatively organised person, I missed the application for the graduate scheme at Knight Frank. And when I realised this, I somewhat panicked, but was given an opportunity, probably because of my work experience, to visit the firm to see if I could find a way onto the graduate scheme, which I did. I will never forget the then head of the commercial business, the late Brian Hatcher, who's a delightful man, said, look, the graduate scheme is full, but if you fancy a job, we're paying our graduates £5,000 a year at the moment. If we offer you 4.5, would you be interested? And I was off my seat and shaking his hands before he could change his mind. The negotiator in me reflects with hindsight, I probably should have said 4,750 before I shook his hand. But anyway, I was only wanting to tell my parents that I had some sort of gainful employment, and started therefore full time at Knight Frank on the graduate scheme in September 1983. And I probably will stop there, other than to say, thinking I would be in London and at Knight Frank for no more than 6 weeks. I then spent the best part of the next 40 years at Knight Frank until I retired in March 2022, having reached 60 in February 2022, the retirement age for equity partners in the firm. And I'm a fan of this, by the way, it remains 60. So you retire in March of your 60th birthday year. So I retired in March last year, and have no regrets for staying there all of my career. I've moved on to do other things, but that's a brief summary.
Well, thank you very much. Sounds like we've got some things in common, particularly when it comes to schooling, grades, and going to decent polytechnics. Was there anything that you've seen later on, or maybe even at school, that was that you've found that you've had learning difficulties, or was it something that you just didn't really feel applied to?
It's a very good question, and I don't know, albeit in the recent months or years, I have looked at my school reports that were always okay in terms of my activities in the classroom, but there seemed to be a disconnect between what happened in the classroom and when I came to put things on paper. So although I've just alluded to the fact my A-levels were pretty disappointing, my GCSEs first time round, O-levels, as they were even more disappointing. And the school reports were a little bit, we're not quite sure why this happened. I suspect in today's world, I would be, and I'm not being patronising to anybody, I would be diagnosed with something. I haven't got a clue what it would be quite. So I think expressing myself on paper was a much more challenging thing than was acknowledged at the time for me. I could have conversations with people. Again, I ended up at Wootton Bassett Comprehensive School. I ended up being head of school, which generally was somebody who was highly academic in that environment. That wasn't the case for me, I can assure you. So, some sort of popularity of being, mischievous or something put me there. I haven't got a clue, if I'm honest.
Right. It's quite interesting. Leaving school, I was given, or from what I can remember, this is the narrative in my head, I was given the options of banking, lawyer, accountancy or property. And of course, I didn't have any of the grades to do 3 of them. So I ended up going to what actually was then a University West of England, to do real estate. And I actually just wonder how many people with learning difficulties or found school difficult ended up in property, actually. It's just something that's just come to me.
Yes, it's an interesting thing. I think if you go through, certainly latterly, the options Knight Frank had to recruit people were far broader in the last 10 years than they were in my first 10 years. I mean, in the first 10 years, it was generally people from Reading University, Cirencester Agricultural College, and 1 or 2, possibly Cambridge, and then 1 or 2, the land economy course at Cambridge, and then 1 or 2 of the standout polytechnics. I think Oxford and Kingston and Bristol, as I recall back then. I'm going back to the early 80s. And it was very rare for Knight Frank or any other of the big surveying and advisory firms to recruit outside that range. Was it a consequence of people's academic background that led to that route, or was it the fact that everybody was quite obsessed about a estate management accredited degree that then gave people a relatively straightforward path to full qualification as a surveyor, which involves, as you know, a 2-year sort of professional competence test before you come out the other end as a qualified surveyor? It's bizarre to say it, but I think it clearly works for real estate, because real estate as an industry, has thrived, possibly because the skills of an advisor in real estate are different than the skills if you're going to be an accountant or a lawyer or a banker, because it is so personal, both commercially and residentially. It's so much about the people that you might say, certainly back then, whether you were a mathematician or not, probably didn't have the same relevance as it might do today. Therefore, as long as you could identify with and demonstrate strong interpersonal skills, you were frankly probably pretty set fair for a good career in real estate.
Yep. You're just reminding me of those two years qualifying as a professional. I think I found, thankfully, actually, and for those who are listening, I actually did this at Knight Frank, and I remember being really well supported, almost better supported than I was during my schooling years, but it was still because of my dyslexia, it was a really, really challenging thing to do, to mix the sort of mathematics of the valuation side and all of the background law. I remember, now looking back, it wasn't the right job for me, because, reading through, I still find it difficult to read my 3-year-old daughter bedtime stories. That's how challenging reading is for me. But reading through leases was a whole new level. It's no surprise it didn't last very long. Anyway, so given those interpersonal skills that you obviously have and really thrived on, where have you taken that past Knight Frank?
So Knight Frank took me on a journey which I had no expectation of when I started, which was to go from being a commercial surveyor doing office agency and development for 25 years into a management role, which then gave me a tremendous platform for which I felt and still feel very privileged in managing parts of the business, and then ultimately the business for the last 9 years of my career. And the only reason for setting that context is that it gave me no doubt at all that once I left Knight Frank, at 60, providing I still had good health, I wanted to keep busy and stay in real estate. COVID taught me that I was absolutely not ready, nor was the rest of my family, by the way, to sort of sit at home and wander around the smallish garden we've got in Putney. I wanted to keep busy from a business perspective. And so the opportunities began to arise once I made this clear as to what I might do post Knight Frank. And therefore, over the last, I left Knight Frank in March 22, and here we are in June 23, and I've got 5 or 6 different roles on. I won't describe them to you all, but whilst it sounds a lot, they're all non-exec advisory type roles. I've got 2 chair roles, but it gives me a good mixture of things to do. I'm challenged by each. I like the businesses I'm involved in. Most importantly, I like all of the people I am working with. Yet in a busy week, if I was to consolidate it, and it doesn't work like this, as you'll understand, but if I was to consolidate it, I would suggest it's 3 days a week, every week. Some weeks it's 5 days, some weeks it's no days, and I have more flexibility on the holidays I can take with my wife and family. So to my mind, I've got enough stimulation to keep me sane and enough freedom to spend time with my family and interest, fresh air and holidays and walking the dogs and those sorts of things, which were often bottom of the list, can now take a much higher priority in what I do every day and every week.
Sure. Well, thank you for explaining that. Actually, it's a nice segue into actually when you were in the crux of being the group chairman of Knight Frank during from what I read, a massive growth spurt or period of the business. How did you actually deal with, I guess, what was pretty much a 24/7 job? How did you actually deal with it?
Do you know what the answer to that is? I don't know, but every individual have their own characteristics, and I think the key to any part of one's life, but in this example, working life, is to try and find out what they are and then put them to best use. And my evolution at Knight Frank, as I say, if anyone had told me 10 years into my career that I might end up being, the boss of the firm, as it were, don't be so ridiculous. Once I got there, and I don't want this to be interpreted in any way arrogant, it sort of felt okay. It felt right. Was it a full-on job? Yes. But if you asked me, and I took it very conscientiously, but if you asked me what I worried about, of course there were difficult days which weighed heavily. But what I really worried about was my family and the things outside of the firm, much more. Much more. As I say, at work and with work, I was very conscientious, but I did have an ability, naturally, rather than forced, to be able to switch off. So, if I got home in the evening after a full day, and I did the hours. I didn't work till midnight, but I was an early starter. But I generally, unless there was an event, would leave between 6 and 6:30. And because the office was in London and I live in southwest London, I could get home in reasonable time, and I made that an absolute focus. And when I got home, I switched off. Occasionally, my wife would want to talk about my day in the office, so I'd switch back on again a bit. But there wasn't a. I got home and a quick supper, and then I had to read a load of papers. There were days when it didn't work perfectly, but generally speaking, I was able to switch off, and I didn't know that would happen. And so one of the things about going into management is that you think, oh my goodness, how's one going to handle that all? I remember saying to people, if I put everything that was on my desk to do in my head, I think my brain would have exploded. But somehow I was disciplined naturally to be able to compartmentalize things, deal with what was urgent to deal with, get things in an order of priority, get them done. I hated being behind. I still do. So get them done. And then that enabled me to have an easier on-off button when it came to home life and other interests.
So you mentioned the main thing that you were worrying about was actually through all of your years of running Knight Frank and obviously being, I guess, ultimately responsible for many people's jobs, careers, and the families that they were supporting as well, was your family. What can you describe some of the concerns, just the day-to-day concerns or the bigger concerns that you had?
No, I think everybody treats their family life differently, and I don't think there's one model. There may be a mood more today to try and create a perfect model, but I don't think there is such a thing. I think each family unit needs to find its own way. My wife and I decided pretty early on that I would focus upon work and my wife would focus upon the job at home. And I mean the job at home. And it's incredibly important. And for me, I found, work was business. And yes, it was a people business. And I took that incredibly seriously. We may come on to it in due course. But for me, the family and the well-being of the family was an absolute priority. So if there was a bump in the road, as there is with young children and families, my wife happened to be very poorly for a few years. Knight Frank supported me. I was able to support her, and we got through it, absolutely. But I made it a priority. I didn't make work the priority first. I had reflections early on of 4 F's, and don't worry, it was firm, family, fitness, and fine wine. Those were my 4 things. What happened on occasions is the order changed. But generally speaking, family first. Probably firm second, and then fitness and fine wine third and fourth. But as I say, depending on your mindset at any one time, the order may change a bit.
Is the fine wine bit why there are rumours of a big bunker under 55 Baker Street by any chance?
Well, I think if one goes back into the annals of Knight Frank or Knight Frank and Rutley, there was an occasion where there was a fine wine cellar, but those days are in the dim and distant past, possibly sadly, but no bunker of fine wine anymore.
Just now in Putney.
Few bottles.
Do you have any regrets about your time at Knight Frank? If you look back at anything that you would have, could have, should have done?
Well, look, there are a raft of things that with hindsight, I would have done differently in the firm.
Is there one or two that you could?
Well, I recount when I was running the commercial business before I took over the firm, my first real growing up lesson in management was the global financial crisis, which still seemed like only yesterday, but was now, 12 years ago or more, well over actually. And that was a very difficult time for the commercial business because the markets stopped. And we've always had one objective at Knight Frank, which I still believe kept the firm well disciplined and in good order for the future. And that was to focus upon making a trading profit every year and not incurring any structural debt. And when we went into the global financial crisis and the commercial markets were hit so hard, my job, I felt, was to trade profitably every year. And that meant reshaping the business pretty aggressively. And looking back, I definitely made some mistakes for which I took full responsibility. One of them, which still lurks in my mind, was we had just taken on the biggest number of graduates ever because we were looking forward to some real growth and didn't anticipate the financial crisis. No one did, really. And frankly, the business didn't want or need the graduates. And I had 2 choices, either to force the business to just keep the graduates doing work or to reduce the scale of our graduate program. And I decided that we would reduce our graduate numbers by half. And so we saw every single graduate over 2 or 3 days and made a decision at the end of that process to reduce the number by half. It was heartbreaking, but actually in that financial year, by taking that cost out of our business, we trebled our profit. So it shows you how tight the margins were. At the time, it felt right. 12 months later, it felt like a disastrous decision, because of course it was that young talent pool who were absolutely required for the next 10 years of growth in the business. And I had single-handedly cut it in half. Now, there were many things I would like to suggest that the business did quite well, but that's one, to your point, that sort of lurks in my mind of, oh goodness. But then management, I came to learn, was about, there's a saying, I don't know whose it is, but the only way you increase the rate of success is by increasing the rate of your failures, because that's the way you learn. And there's no doubt in my mind that I personally learned a great deal through the global financial crisis and managing the business, which then helped me with a bit more confidence take on the overall helm of the business in 2013 and then for the next 9 years.
Well, this is definitely quite a healing moment. I mean, because for those who are listening, I was actually one of, I guess, that 50% of graduates who was let go during the financial crisis, and at the time, it really stung. It really stung. I was like, why me? How about, I've sort of bleed Knight Frank. That's how much I cared about the job. And I thought that, that I was going to be, because I was in the mindset, my father had been a very much, one job kind of career guy as well. And that was sort of the way in which I guess my head was programmed. But actually 6 months before that did happen, I was offered a job by CBRE in Hong Kong, and I turned it down because I felt this great sense of loyalty, and that, in fact, London wasn't quite finished for me. But actually being let go from Knight Frank, and I always say this to people who are struggling or who have been let go or something bad has happened in their life, always opens up another door. It always, and invariably, it can be a better door as well. And for me, moving to Hong Kong and actually getting out of the sort of preconditions that I had been set for my life, which were go and get a job in London, stay in London, marry a girl who's probably from the M3 corridor-ish, and, have 2.4 kids. And that was actually fundamentally never me. That's going to be right for a lot of people, but it was actually fundamentally not right for me in my spirit. And hence I ended up in Hong Kong having a great time with CBRE for 3 years, and then I moved on to Bali, but that's a whole nother story. But I wouldn't be here sitting in this chair having this conversation with you if you hadn't made that decision.
Well, I've forgotten that for your listeners, so this wasn't contrived. But what is interesting, and it isn't to clear my conscience at all because there's no way of doing that, but what is interesting is I have kept in touch with a number of those graduates who were let go. And it was hard for everybody. And I can only say it was also hard for me and the other people involved at the time, particularly in HR, who have got to sort of deal with what the business is asking. A delightful lady called Gemma Osman, who you may remember, Pete, who was dealing with it. And she was a very good person who was dealing with a incredibly difficult thing. But that was her role. My point is that when everyone deals with aggressive business decisions that look cutthroat, for want of a better description, it is probably for everybody's benefit that those decisions are made. As I've acknowledged, mistakes are made, but there is no point for either side of that equation, people remaining in a position where there's no particular role for them, because that's no good it's certainly not good for the business. And it's certainly not good for them. So actually, the maturity with which you reflect upon that moment in your life was, I suggest, echoed by most of those who left the business at that same time, some of whom, as I say, I've kept in touch with and seen and said, look, that was a horrible period, as it was for me, but it was a chapter that was much needed in my sort of book of life.
It's interesting that you talk about Gemma, because she definitely got the wrath of a fairly angry young man at the time. And then it was actually at that point that I had my first communications with Sally, who now is helping me and supporting me and coaching me with The Privileged Man. So everything comes full circle.
Absolutely.
Which is really, really wonderful. And as I say, quite healing, because to a 25, 26-year-old man who thought he was doing the best and to be let go, it definitely did hurt, but it was a great lesson Not saying that everyone needs to be fired, but it's a great lesson to learn early on.
Well, I think the great attribute most humans have got is flexibility and agility. You just don't know it on occasion, and as you say, nobody wants to be fired, but who would? But if you use the opportunity of that transition to really think and focus upon what you want to do, you make a virtue out of it.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So, moving on a little bit, in my research that I did for this podcast, I spoke to a couple of people who have worked with you at the sort of top level, and they all come out with this relatively the same words, and that's inspirational. Don't go pink in the cheeks. Inspirational, fair, and authentic. And I guess what I'd like to ask is, how did you, throughout a time where you were an agent to start with and had to be in that sales atmosphere, how did you remain authentic?
Well, I think it's got to go back to upbringing and parents, and what you're guided on early in your life as to what is important and what isn't. And I had this in my mind from the beginning that going right back to the beginning again, that I needed to get a job and I needed to respect people, and that was sort of my upbringing. So there was never any, and as I say, I had attributes that whilst not academic, I found it relatively easy to get on with people, anybody really. And I've always been straightforward, not aggressive or necessarily. I've had my moments. I'm sure people will dig up or dig out, but generally speaking, straightforward. And keep reminding yourself to be yourself. Easy to say, not always easy to implement for everybody, but I found it easy. So the business conscience that I always had was, I'm doing what I believe fundamentally is the right thing for me, the right thing for the business, and the right thing for the people in it. And if you're doing that to the best of your ability, even though on occasions it's wrong, it's quite difficult to be caught out or get into a trap, because you're just doing the best possible thing. And if you don't like it, then don't use me as an agent. Or if you don't like it within Knight Frank, then move me on or move me to do something different within the business. But I'm just going to do the best I possibly can. And be honest with people. I think the real estate community is a small one. I mean, people might see it as a vast commercial enterprise, but it's actually an incredibly small world. I think many business communities actually are. And so if you aren't going to be yourself, and you're therefore going to say one version of events to one person and another version of events to another, or one version of yourself to one group and then another person, or another representation of yourself to somebody, I think you're going to get caught out really quickly. And you've either got to be super smart or very, very thick-skinned to pull that off. And my only option was to be myself. So when I was challenged at Knight Frank, as I often was, by people or by the decisions I was trying to make, I knew I wasn't always right by a country mile, but I was doing what I felt was best, and I could only articulate it in one way, which was the honest way. And if somebody asked me the same question 10 times, I would have to give the same answer, because it's the only answer I was able to give. So just being truthful to oneself, and then reflecting that in everything you do, is the best lesson in life I could give anybody. Rule I work by. I'm not sure that made me inspiring or motivational, but to use your word, it did make me authentic, because it was me. It was, I couldn't deal with it any other way.
Isn't that interesting? It's like being authentic is almost so rare in this world that it is almost inspiring. I think particularly in a corporate setting.
That could be right. That could be right. I go back to one thing which may help one to be oneself. I was conscientious. So, and I still am. So if I had something to do, I would do it to the best of my ability. I would prepare for it. I always had this horrible fear of doing a presentation or a pitch to a client or a discussion to the firm. I did have a fear of not being properly prepared. So I would do the background. And the reason for that, I think, was if you are properly prepared, then you're in the best possible shape you can be to deal with it. That doesn't mean to say you try and not be yourself. Far from it. It just gives you more confidence to be yourself. People used to say to me, in a humbling way for me, that I was quite good at presenting to people. And that was because I was just saying what I wanted to say, but having prepared well for it. And I was nervous. I mean, any time I took to a platform or a stage, I was incredibly nervous, but I was well prepared.
Right. I was going to ask you about that and public speaking, whether you enjoyed it.
If I'm well prepared, the answer is I did learn to quite enjoy it, actually. And I liked the Q&A piece that I would often invite to follow, for the simple reason that I learned that as long as I was going to give my answer in the best way I knew, you can sort of never get caught out. People might disagree, and they might want to debate around my opinion on something, but it was my opinion. It wasn't manufactured.
Sure. Did you ever have any coaching or mentoring through your career?
Yes, I did. Yes. And latterly, I mean, there were a number of people that Knight Frank gave groups of us access to, and were well qualified to give you some guidance as to how best to get your message across. I think the balance with that, which is why there may be some hesitancy in my voice, is that coaching is great. I'm a great fan of it, and mentoring, great fan of it, providing it plays to your strengths, and it doesn't try and create something out of you that you're not. Because then I think when you stand up, it's not you. So I think the great coaches and the great mentors are people that identify characteristics in somebody and can then guide them to make the very best of those characteristics, rather than say, don't do that, don't do this, don't do this. You've got to do it this way because that's what the book says. That's not coaching, to my mind. That's not mentoring. Coaching and mentoring is about identifying the best in someone and then getting them to work out how to make best advantage of those situations. And the people I ended up working most closely with in that regard were those very people who I felt got me and were able then to guide me to be a better me.
The good listeners, perhaps, the ones who listened the most and actually heard.
Yep.
Because those who, there are those coaches out there who will sort of go, yeah, and then this is the way it is, and take you down a completely different path. Yeah. And that's what we created the Privileged Man for, so that there's actually a place for men to speak truthfully, honestly, authentically, where perhaps they feel as though they can't actually do that in the environment that they either work in or live in. And for a lot of men, perhaps with a bit of a different story to you, that's actually a bit more of a struggle. And so actually relearning to become that authentic child almost, the actual joyful child that wasn't processed down into, an institution or an education where actually they became a different person. So anyway, there's a little plug for the Privileged Man.
Quite right.
And just on the personal development side that you talk about, that Knight Frank provided, there's a lot of talk in social media nowadays about what the government needs to provide, what the companies need to provide, particularly around mental health, and how that's almost the company's responsibility. How did that go for you? And how far do you feel it is the institutional responsibility as opposed to the personal responsibility to sort one's mental health out?
I mean, now this is a massive subject today, and it's not one that I'm an expert upon, but it is very clear that either there is a development of much greater mental health issues or much greater mental health awareness than there was 30 or 40 years ago. Do I know the answer to whether they were ignored 40 years ago, or, just get on with it attitude, or whether there is an evolutionary issue here which has created greater mental health problems? I'm not that expert, but it is very clear, as you allude to, that the mental health challenges that young people have today appear to be far greater than they were when I first started work. And I don't say that, again, in a dismissive way. There seems to be a much greater occurrence. As to where the responsibility lies and how it is addressed, again, I don't think there's a straightforward answer, Pete, but I do think it doesn't rest with one group. I don't think an employer should have it placed at their door that they are responsible for 100% of the well-being of their people. And I feel that dial has turned too much towards the corporations, the businesses, to find the solution. I think it's family, I think it's friends, I think it's the right support structure through the institutions that exist. I don't think it's the NHS, because we have seen the NHS is not fit for purpose anymore. It's a complicated, big, controversial subject, but it is simply not. And to overload it with the responsibility of another whole host of well-being, it simply doesn't have the capacity. So I don't have the answer, but I know the answer mustn't rest just with business. It has to rest with the collective of, if I have a friend who I think is going through a crisis, I'll make myself as available as they want, and as I'm sure their family would. And I think those units are going to be much better able to support that individual or that family than a business. I think the business's key responsibility is to show compassion and flexibility, which may not have been around 40 years ago. So I think that's the big shift, to be aware that these issues exist, to offer support and flexibility in the workplace, so that the pressure is taken off a bit, and that individual or those individuals are able to spend more time with their support group in order to address the challenges they're facing, which, let's be honest, may be much more complicated and go well beyond only mental health. But to use that as an example, I think that's the role a corporation, an employer should play.
Super interesting. For what it's worth, I agree with you. It's it's a huge subject, and one in which I find there's a lot of expectation, particularly online, that it's the company that is paying them that needs to sort out a whole host of issues now. And it's a reasonable expectation, actually. It's just not, the business is not set up for that reason. And personal responsibility was actually a word that I only learnt, or a phrase that I only learnt when I hit my particular wall about 8 years ago, because there was a lot of, it's the government's fault, it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault. It's very much in the victim mentality, rather than actually being like having a look and a bit deeper within ourselves and going, well, actually, how did I create this situation? And what am I going to do actually to resolve it? But it takes a little bit of courage to actually look inside and actually take responsibility. And on that, there's this quote that I really love around vulnerability, and that's by Brené Brown. It's, there is no intimacy without vulnerability. Vulnerability breeds connection and trust. And I just wanted to sort of explore that in terms of leadership. How vulnerable were you in your leadership? And how do you feel that bred connection and trust within the partnership of Knight Frank and further down into the individuals working?
Well, look, I would never have been a sole trader. I would never have been a good person to have operated on my own. So the Knight Frank environment, which suited and worked for me, was one that I always felt was very collaborative and very supportive. And although as my role grew from being a sort of buccaneering agent to a manager of the commercial business to looking after the firm, as I say, as I looked forward before I took on those roles, I would have been in awe of them and thought way beyond me. But once you got there, it felt okay. And that was largely, in my case, because I thoroughly enjoyed the engagement with most of the people that I was working with. Always some challenges, always some bumps, but as a generalization, that's what I felt. And yes, of course, there are lonely periods as a leader where the decision rests with you. But the environment within which I operated was one that, having taken the counsel of the people around me who I respected, liked and trusted, by the time I got to make the decision, I felt I had absolute confidence in that decision because I had the support of the people around me. And so there's no question that the vulnerability existed, but the way I mitigated that in a Knight Frank environment was to make sure I took the right soundings from a broad group of people, of course, not all of whom, forgive me, agreed with me, but they help me make a better informed decision. I was never happy making a decision I didn't agree with, but I may have adapted the emphasis of the decision as a consequence of those interactions.
Really interesting. Okay, so it brings me on to being group chairman of Knight Frank is almost more than just a business role. It sort of has a historical role to it, and one in which is really very well known within the property industry. But there's a sense of awe that people maybe who come to meet you would feel when it's like, here's a group chairman of Knight Frank, Alistair Elliott. I certainly feel it. And I certainly felt it, walking into your offices like I did with my wife, I think it was 18 months ago now, and going, well, look, I was like, look, babe, this is a big deal. This could open up quite a few doors. But I was there to be my authentic self, to tell my story, and so was my wife as well. And which had taken me many years, actually, to be frank, to actually get to that point of being the real me. For guys who perhaps still struggle with that, did you find there was a sense that sometimes you could tell someone was sitting in front of you and giving you advice or just saying things that you knew they were saying just to please you, rather than actually saying the truth? Did you actually ever have to be like, come on, mate, just tell me the actual truth?
I think there's no doubt that I have to acknowledge your point that when anyone goes into an environment they don't know or aren't 100% familiar with or have lost connection with, and then they're seeing, I don't know how you describe it, the number one person or the leader, there's a degree of, what should I say? I spent my life doing it because I spent my life and thoroughly enjoyed it, engaging with clients right to the end of my career. I felt, and of course, I was going in to see some senior people in our industry all the time. And so I knew how people felt. And to start with, you're right, conversations were a bit stiff. And I felt I could identify that. And my objective was to, as quickly as possible, without having to be too prescriptive as to how it was articulated, but to quickly as possible put people at ease, to say, tell me really what's on your mind, and then deal with it as best I possibly could. But was I successful in that? I don't really know. But the way I taught myself to try and be more successful at it was by seeing a lot of people a lot of the time. So whether they were graduates or apprentices, or whether they were senior executives in the industry, my door was always open. To my knowledge, I never declined anybody a meeting. Would other people have done it for me? Possibly, but I doubt it. If anybody took the trouble to contact me, I would, without exception, go back to them. And if they wanted to meet me, I would always meet them. Not because I was feeling I was being virtuous, but because I felt the way I would be better informed as a leader of the business was to hear as many views as possible. That doesn't mean to say agree with them all. It just means to hear them all. So I would try and as quickly as possible put people at ease and then just let them be themselves. Once they get to that position, they then tell you exactly what's on their mind. They may come in with a oh my goodness, I've got to say this, I've got to do it this way. But once you can get people to that position, then they just tell you the way it is, everything. And it's so informing and of great value, I found, to me.
So is that sort of door open, being warm and just allowing people to, almost in a counsellor priest position, sort of allow people just to sort of relax in your...
Yeah, I would say so. Look, I always had an office, so there may be people that listen to this here, but the door was always open. And if anybody wanted to come in, and the reason I always had an office was not out of any delusion. It was because I didn't want to spend all my time whispering or in a meeting room. So of course, there are sensitive conversations. And if I'm honest, I wanted the opposite, that somebody knew if they came into the office, they could close the door and say whatever they wanted to me. Nobody else was going to hear what they were doing. And I actually found that better for me, and I would like to suggest better for my leadership than if I had, had a slightly larger desk but out in the field. I can see great value in that, particularly for market-facing teams. But in the role I had, I just felt at that stage it was better to have an office but with the door wide open, and those people that did take the trouble to know me or get to know me always knew they could pop in anytime they wanted, and that's from 18-year-olds to 58-year-olds.
How important was it for you to feel a sense of community at work, a sense of community that you really could rely on the people around you, not just as work colleagues, but also friends? You mentioned earlier about your wife being poorly. Did you really feel that sense of community and therefore an added sense of loyalty when such...
I felt, look, I was very loyal to Knight Frank. I believe Knight Frank was always very supportive of me. And as I said earlier, I would have been no good doing my thing as a sole practitioner. I needed a team around me, no question. I loved that environment, whether it was as an agent or as a manager of the business. And I didn't get on with everybody as great mates. And I think there's a fine line there in any business, even in a partnership. But Knight Frank definitely had a community feel about it that I don't feel I heard reflected in many other businesses. Doesn't make Knight Frank perfect, but I think it's a good attribute to have, and that worked for me, and quite genuinely, therefore, when we faced challenges, as we all do, when I faced challenges, having that framework within which to operate made it much easier to deal with the crises of the day, whatever they were, and yes, I developed strong friendships with many people in the firm over the years, and many of them, of course, remain close friends now. I don't think I would have been a leader or a good leader in a business that didn't offer that strong camaraderie amongst its team.
Right. Very interesting. It's definitely something that I miss. I actually wrote a piece in The Independent a couple of years ago about having that team camaraderie at school, and then leaving school, and then being basically on my own, and just actually how traumatic with a small t that was. And I didn't actually recognize that until well into my 30s, that actually that had been a big transition that I was not ready for. And actually, to be honest, leaving the corporate world when I did around 29, that was also something I hugely miss. And it's actually one of the reasons why I created The Privileged Man was actually to create a sense of brotherhood and a sense of actual, friendship and community and connection to come together. Because actually being a leader, especially being an entrepreneur, is very lonely. There are quite a few guys within the Privileged Man community who run and do their own thing, and they really enjoy coming and each week to actually get what's going on off their chest, because they have a particularly smaller network of work than you would say in the corporate world. But it's a challenge once leaving that community, and I sort of would ask, what's that been like having left?
Well, look, as I say, keeping in real estate and keeping busy has led to me taking on a number of roles, and I've enjoyed the transition. I mean, departing Knight Frank was emotionally a much bigger deal than I anticipated. But if I'm honest, once I left, I haven't really looked back. I've reflected very much on the privilege it gave me and the platform it gave me, but I don't pine to go back. Because I've been very fortunate in the roles I've taken on, which are, yes, I'm sort of my own person. I don't have one place of work to go to. I've got several businesses that I'm working really closely with, and I'm enjoying. I always said I would only work with either businesses I liked and respected and or people I like and respected, and that's exactly what I've done. I wasn't going to start taking on roles where I was going to be blasted on a Sunday night from some private equity guy in America to lambast me for what I hadn't done on Saturday. That was not going to be my thing. I wanted to have flexibility whilst having a series of roles with, as I say, to repeat, people and businesses I respected. And I've been incredibly fortunate to have been approached by a number of those, and I'm enjoying it immensely. Rather than having one business, e.g. Knight Frank, which offered me the camaraderie and support that I felt I needed in order to get on with my day job, I've now got several businesses that each offer me that in their own way, and I've still, thank goodness, got my wife and family at home. So it's and I don't take it any day for granted. It's a win-win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Sounds great. You opened the door for me. I've got to go there. Emotionally, you said that leaving Knight Frank, was an emotional time. What kind of emotions did you feel?
Well, I mean, the support everyone showed me in my last few weeks and days, and then my last day was humbling. I mean, I still, it's difficult to think about it now, but I went around the office on the last day. If I'd stopped, I think I'd still be there. And I just decided I had to keep on walking, and I did. And then I left the building, and that was it. But that was a moment. I think the warmth people showed to me was extraordinary. But to my mind, that was about the warmth they also had for each other, and the warmth the organisation held, which I have no doubt it will still have. And so, yes, of course, I was grateful for the send-off. But I also reflect that actually just showed what a great business it was, and what, good people they were, and the warmth between them as well as the warmth they were showing me.
Oh, I remember, actually, now you say it, I remember seeing it on social media. You sort of almost had a tunnel around the whole of the office, didn't you, that you had to walk down?
Exactly, I did, which, as I say, was a bit of a surprise for me, and I didn't take the video nor post it, but I have seen it, and as I could see I'm keeping moving. If I'd stopped, it would have been tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. What a way to leave. You actually just did walk straight out of the office?
Well, I did go back to my office. I said cheerio to my team, and then left the building. Had my card taken away, had my computer taken away, and went home. That was it. Cut off the email. But that's what made it an emotional, thing, because it was final. And it's quite right, because I would be no good half in and half out. So, and I'd known for a long time that March 22 was the day. So as I said earlier, emotionally, that was a much bigger deal than I thought. But equally, because of the things I have on and the things I had planned, that's enabled me not to dwell and pine and look back.
So it's not like you're like the ex-presidents of the USA and you have a sort of WhatsApp group with Nick and Will and, you're all sort of chatting to one another.
I do have connections with a number of them, but not in a professional capacity.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
Right. Okay. Good stuff. I think sort of to get a little bit serious for a second, one of the experiences that I had in my short career in property, which was very difficult for me to sort of get through, was the expectation that of the socially accepted use of, or maybe even abuse of alcohol. And that was something that within the industry, certainly when I was working in it, was almost expected. It was actually sort of expected that if you wanted to do the deal, there was this sort of link between doing deals and getting out and boozing and meeting people. How did you deal with that? And also how, if you were to talk to a young aspiring agent, in fact, young aspiring business man or woman, what would you say to them if they felt that pressure?
Okay. Again, another big subject, Pete. You're making me think. Look, when I don't think it's real estate, by the way, I would challenge you. I think it was business, certainly business in the big cities of the world, that whether you were in media, insurance, banking, real estate, there was a culture of living in the fast lane, and that was linked to partying, no question. And hands up, look, when I started in the 80s, that was something I found quite attractive, and the sort of social engagement that offered, I enjoyed. And the culture of our industry in the 80s was your network was built because of that, and often involved, going out at lunchtime and drinking and going back to the office and doing your work and then going out in the evening and drinking and with colleagues, with clients, with everybody. And I can imagine, although I didn't relate to it at the time, so hands up, I can imagine that if you didn't find that appealing, it was difficult. I think the world, in lots of respects, is changing, and it's changing now rapidly. But even in my mind, I'm now of an age that I can still relate to. I still saw it all happen. But, if latterly I was invited out for lunch, and I did a lot of breakfast, lunch and supper, if I was invited out for lunch, my heart sank if somebody I was taking out say they wanted a drink, because I just didn't want one. I just didn't. Would I look forward to a drink in the evening? Absolutely, if we were. But lunchtime, I just didn't want it. I was too conscious of trying to keep sensible and healthy, and at least a little bit, perhaps making up for past misdemeanors. Now, my feeling is that mood is moving quite rapidly towards it's probably not great. How one disconnects celebration of an event, a big deal in property, how one disconnects that celebration with going to the pub and going out and having a few drinks completely, I don't know. And it may not be wrong, but what we've got to work harder at is making people that don't want to drink a lot feel comfortable in that environment for as long as they would like to be there. And that's work in progress. But so I think two things are happening. I think one, people are spending a bit more time thinking about their health. And that is removing, even I would suggest people, or maybe driven by people early in their careers who just don't want that at lunchtime. So that bit's gone, and the building of network and connectivity is happening in different ways. But I don't think we're out of it completely. And I believe the world is changing and adapting, but it's very much work in progress. Could somebody enter real estate today and get involved in the heartbeat of big transactions, which 40 years ago would have had to have been associated with a big party and drinking? Could that person today get involved, be successful, without being drawn into having to do that? I believe they could.
Thank you. That was great. Very, very, very eloquently put. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I thought I was good at it. But, there's a couple of pints at lunchtime, like you say, I would go back to my desk. There were guys who had the constitution to just keep going. I was not one of them. My head would, hit the keyboard, or I'd be off walking around and trying to get, my third or fourth coffee of the day just to stay awake. Just didn't work for me.
And there's one other area, which of course is another big subject altogether. And that is, if one is encouraging, for the good of the industry, for the good of the business, a broader diversity in your workforce, then that has to come with a greater understanding that people view things differently. Some people have to get back to their families. Quite right. Some people's culture and religion doesn't allow them to celebrate in the same way. And, those things wouldn't have even been thought of for a moment in the 80s by the vast majority of people. And now they are front of mind and need to be considered as, the consequences of all those things need to be thought about.
And I love this quote about it, is when a man is addicted, his loved ones often become hostages to his addiction. And I think when people, talk about addiction, they normally think about drugs or alcohol or sex or whatever it is. But rarely do we talk about workaholism. And I heard you talk in another podcast about the virtues of working hard. Do you think there is a fine line between workaholism and working hard?
I do. And of course, it is a fine line. And in this regard, technology has not helped, because the one thing the business community now assumes is that everybody is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Let's be honest, when I started, no mobile phones, no computers at home, well, limited computers in the office. When you left the office, that was it. You turned off. Weekends, if your time was off, it was off. The evolution, and we may be about to turn back the other way, which is to your point, the evolution has been, you are expected to be available all the time, and particularly in the services industry. And I felt I was. I didn't begrudge it. It was just what I was expected to do. That said, I believe individuals have to take responsibility themselves, with support if it's needed, but have to take responsibility themselves for what they are prepared to let happen. You now see increasingly on emails what that person's availability is. I'm only in the office. This isn't a working from home thing, by the way, Pete. This is just a working practice thing. I'm only in the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or I only work for this organisation on Tuesdays or Thursdays, or my hours are 9:30 to 5:30, which is pretty much setting up a message that don't expect to hear from me if you send me an email in those times. 5 years ago, I suspect you would have got fired for putting that on your on the end of an email. I don't know. So we're moving somewhere. Different people require different things, don't they? And some people thrive at work. If you tell a professional footballer, play less football, what are they going to say? I love it. I want to play more football. Give me another game. And I think, we can't put it all in the same box, but the discipline that we are on course to working out is, when is it acceptable to be on call, and when is it acceptable to say, no, sorry, this is my family time, this is my holiday, this is my leisure time, whatever it may be. And I think we are somewhere in the midst of that transition at this moment from 10 years ago, probably from the Big Bang, actually 20 years ago, when it was almost exciting. Oh, great, I've got all of this stuff that can make me accessible all the time. Yippee-doo, mobile phones, computers, smartphones, everybody's, brilliant. I've got everything. And that means I'm accessible all the time. But even worse than that, Pete, people expect decisions quicker. And that isn't healthy. And perhaps we are in this, as I say, I described it as the mist of transition between where we were in the 80s, you switch on and you switch off from work because the technology didn't allow you to do it any other way, to being available for everything all of the time, to now thinking, hold on a minute, how are we going to do a demarcation between when I'm working and when I'm doing whatever I choose to do outside of work? I may choose to work 24/7. But allow the flexibility for other people to decide they want to switch off at these times, and that's sacrosanct. I mean, look, even it's done for different reasons, but I think financial services now in the city insist for at least 2 weeks of the year, your holiday is no emails. I think that's actually a governance issue to make sure there's nothing dodgy going on. But it's not bad. You're going to have that 2 weeks off in August, and you're not going to have any interaction with the business at all.
Yeah. So with hearing all of that, and I'm just sitting here thinking, and I talked to my dad about this as well, and the understanding of perhaps your generation and my father's generation, and the amount of compassion they can have for younger men who have literally a phone, younger men and women, of course, who have the phones with them 24/7, but haven't learned the habits that you did in your early years which I'm putting two and two together now, that you could go back to your family and turn off. It was a habit, perhaps, that you learned very early that you didn't have to actually respond. If you were talking to a younger Alistair now, who was 30, just got married, having a few younger kids, but was very much into his agency world and wanting to climb to the top of whatever industry he was in, what would your sort of tips be for him to keep it together?
Yeah. So one bit we didn't touch on, I'm conscious of time, so I will be brief, but is work ethic. Work ethic and productivity. I can't help but be a bit old-fashioned, I suspect, in some of your listeners' eyes by saying that I do think you get out of life what you put in. And that applies to every aspect of your life, by the way. So I've still got it in my head that if you work hard, you'll do better. And I still believe that is still the case. Acknowledging, however, that again, businesses and their people and their families need to work out what the right balance is. And that's a team effort in every respect of the word. But it's a team effort between the business and their teams, and it's a team effort between their teams and their families. I think, again, it's an area of evolution to find out what is right, but I don't think it's one model or one answer suits all. Productivity, however, is fundamental to anything in life. Again, family or business. But if you don't produce as much, you can't expect as much. And therefore, I don't buy 4 days a week makes a business as effective as a 5-day-a-week business. I understand there's lots of work out there that's suggesting that might not be right, but I don't get it. I can't sell a house on a Friday if I'm not working on a Friday. So where's the line there between where's the work-life balance line? I think people need to work it out for themselves, acknowledging that if you work 10% of your 100% capacity, you cannot expect 100% back, because that's not a good business model, and then nobody wins. Finding the right balance is work in progress. I don't believe there's one model that suits all. Fundamentally, I think hard work is rewarding. That doesn't mean 24/7. It means effectiveness.
Right. So interesting, because that's, again, I really resonate with what you say. And I try and, talk to my wife about this the whole time, and she finds me so functional in a way. What is the ROI on this? Is it really worth our time invested to go to the playground right now, or should I be doing something else? But yeah, anyway, a good balance like that makes me go with the flow a little bit more. Just to wrap things up, I've got a couple of property questions. One in which is, what is your feeling around the working from home, hybrid and office model? Where do you think we're really going to land?
Well, I think we will land with a hybrid. But I don't think there is a hybrid. I think the very nature of hybrid in a working environment is it has to adapt for different businesses and different functions. I am generally of the view, better together, that if you're creating a culture in a business, if you're creating an environment where people can learn from each other, can develop their networks, can learn a trade, you are going to be better in a work environment. People are obsessed with the word office. I get that. I fully understand why. That's all I did when I had a proper job doing transactions. I was always office related, so I'm biased towards it. But, I think one's got to be very careful with putting out there working from home as a thing that might be okay for everybody. Well, I used to say, that Denise, who used to run front of house at Knight Frank, I used to use her as an example. I'm sure she'll forgive me should she ever listen to this, that she can't work from home. So why is it all right for other people to leave her there when they're picking and choosing when they choose to come in? It doesn't feel right to me. Flexibility for family, flexibility for the carpet fitter to come into the house, which possibly would have been frowned upon, flexibility for getting your job done to the best of your ability, 100%. Out of that comes a hybrid pattern in whatever form, great. I mean, ultimately, it may have changed since I've moved on, but the Knight Frank model was entrusting people to make a decision. You make a decision as to where you can get your job done best, and you take responsibility for the consequences of that. But my suggestion was always, if in doubt, you go to the workplace, whatever that is.
Brilliant. Really interesting. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for your time. It's really enlightening. Thank you.
Great pleasure, Pete. Thank you very much for inviting me.